every show you ran home to watch after school had already been canceled. Not old, not classic, canceled. Done. Off the air. The networks had already moved on, and someone just needed something cheap to fill the 4 o'clock slot, so they dug these shows out of storage, sold them to local stations for next to nothing, and put them on right when you walked through the door. That's it. That's the whole reason your childhood had a soundtrack. I'm Frank, and I've spent more time studying television than most people spend doing anything. And what I found when I went through the history of every show you grew up watching in the afternoon is that almost all of them flopped the first time around. The Brady Bunch never once made the top 30 most watched shows during its entire original run. Not once. Gilligan's Island got canceled because a network executive needed the time slot for something else. Hogan's Heroes, Bewitched, The Munsters, all of them were already dead before you were old enough to turn on a TV. And yet, you remember every theme song, every character, every running joke. The people those shows were actually made for barely remember them. You, the generation that got the leftovers, turned them into legends. Today, we're going through them one by one. The shows that owned your afternoons, what they actually were, what was really going on behind them, and why a generation of kids who had nothing to do with their original broadcast ended up caring about them more than anyone else ever did. Picture it. It's 3:15. You just got off the bus or walked 3 blocks home. You drop your backpack on the floor, not in your room, on the floor, right there by the door, and the very first thing you do is turn on the TV. Not grab a snack, not check anything, the TV goes on first. And depending on where you lived, you got a slightly different lineup, but across most of the United States between roughly 3:30 and 6 p.m., local stations were running the same shows that had already been on network TV years earlier and were now being sold cheap to local channels to fill airtime. That's what syndication was. TV channels needed content. The studios had old shows gathering dust. Someone made a deal. You got Gilligan's Island at 4 p.m. Nobody planned it as a gift to you. It was just business, but it accidentally became your whole childhood. Now, here's what's fascinating. The kids in school the next day, you talked about these shows. Not like, did you see the news last night? No, you quoted them, you debated them, you had opinions about characters the way people today have opinions about sports teams. Mary Ann or Ginger, the Addams family or the Munsters, that argument was settled in playgrounds across America for 2 decades straight, and the side you picked said a lot about you. So let's go through them, one by one, the shows that owned your afternoons, what they actually were, what was really going on behind them, and why a generation of kids who had nothing to do with their original broadcast ended up caring about them more than anyone else ever did.
Gilligan's Island. 7 people, 1 boat. A 3-hour tour that goes so wrong they end up stranded on an uncharted island in the Pacific. A bumbling first mate named Gilligan keeps ruining every escape plan. That's the whole show. Gilligan's Island ran on CBS from 1964 to 1967. 3 seasons, 98 episodes. And critics absolutely hated it. The people who reviewed television for a living called it stupid, absurd, and pointless. One of the most mocked shows in TV history. The CBS president told the show's creator, a man named Sherwood Schwartz, and these are his actual words, "I still hate your show, but the audience seems to love it, so we're putting it on." That's a real quote. And yet, 98 episodes, constant reruns for decades, a theme song so infectious that people in a Reddit comment section last week said they saw the video on mute and the song started playing in their heads anyway. You didn't even need to hear it, your brain just ran it. Here's the thing about Gilligan's Island that most people don't know. The show was actually more popular in syndication than it ever was when it originally aired. Meaning, boomers watched it first, sure, but Gen X turned it into a legend. Local stations in the 1970s and 80s put it in the late afternoon, right when you were walking through the door, and you watched those 98 episodes over and over until you knew every single plot. And here's a fact that is almost too good. The boat on the show, the SS Minnow, was named specifically to make fun of Newton Minnow. He was the chairman of the FCC, the government agency that oversees TV. In 1961, Minnow gave a famous speech calling American television, quoting him directly, a vast wasteland. Sherwood Schwartz, the show's creator, named the boat that caused all the trouble after the man who insulted TV. Petty? Yes. Hilarious? Completely. One more thing about the characters. The 7 castaways, Gilligan, the skipper, Thurston Howell III and his wife, Ginger, the movie star, Mary Ann, the farm girl, and the professor, were not random. Schwartz designed them as a small version of society. Rich people, working people, a celebrity, an academic, and 2 guys at the bottom doing most of the actual work while everyone else complained. Some people have pointed out that the 7 characters line up loosely with the 7 deadly sins. The Howells represent greed, Ginger, vanity, the professor, pride, the skipper, anger, and Gilligan, well, Gilligan is just Gilligan. The Ginger versus Mary Ann debate, by the way, was the defining question of Gen X masculinity in the 1980s, and the answer was always Mary Ann. Every time. That's not an opinion. That's just what happened. The Brady Bunch. This one is going to genuinely surprise you. The Brady Bunch ran from 1969 to 1974. A widower with 3 boys marries a widow with 3 girls. They live in a big suburban house with a housekeeper named Alice. The show is wholesome, upbeat, and ends every episode with everyone learning something and smiling about it. Here is what you probably don't know. During its entire original run, all 5 seasons, every single episode, the Brady Bunch never once made it into the top 30 most watched shows on television. Not once. The show that you think of as one of the most iconic American TV programs of all time was, statistically, a middling failure during its first run. It got canceled in 1974 because the contract ran out and the ratings weren't good enough to justify renegotiating. The actors didn't even know it was the last episode when they filmed it. They just showed up, did the scene, went home, and then found out later, hey, that was it. The show's over. And then something interesting happened. In 1975, the episodes entered syndication. Local stations started airing them in the late afternoon, every weekday, right when kids were getting home from school. And the entire show became a different thing. The producers, it turns out, had planned for this. They deliberately dressed the Brady family in clothing that wouldn't look obviously dated. No crazy patterns, no super specific 70s fashion. They wanted the show to feel timeless so it would hold up in reruns years later. It worked. You watched it in 1982 and it didn't feel old. And here's something almost nobody knows. Because the show went into syndication so fast and got repeated so many times, the cast stopped receiving residuals, money from reruns, by around 1979. The show ran thousands of times after that. They got nothing. Susan Olsen, who played Cindy Brady, confirmed this. The most repeated show of your childhood barely paid the people who made it. The Brady Bunch was also created by the same man who made Gilligan's Island, Sherwood Schwartz. So the 2 shows most associated with Gen X after-school TV, the 2 that always seemed to air back-to-back, came from the same brain, running on the same afternoon block day after day for years. The man basically wrote the soundtrack to your 4 p.m. Hogan's Heroes. This one has a story underneath it that changes everything about how you see the show. Hogan's Heroes ran on CBS from 1965 to 1971. The premise is that a group of Allied prisoners of war in a German POW camp during World War II are secretly running a spy operation right under the Nazis' noses. Colonel Hogan is the smart American running the whole thing. Colonel Klink, the German commandant, is a pompous fool. Sergeant Schultz, the guard, famously sees everything and responds by saying, "I see nothing, I know nothing." Critics at the time had a problem with this. You're making a comedy set in a Nazi prisoner of war camp. How is that okay? And the answer turns out to be more interesting than anyone expected. Look at who was playing the Germans. Werner Klemperer played Colonel Klink. His family, Jewish, fled Nazi Germany in 1935 to escape persecution. John Banner played Sergeant Schultz, the lovable, bumbling guard. Banner was from Vienna. His family members perished in the Holocaust. Leon Askin played General Burkhalter, Klink's superior. He was a Viennese Jew. His parents died in Treblinka. Robert Clary played Corporal Lebeau, the French prisoner. At the age of 16, Clary was sent to a Nazi concentration camp. He was liberated from Buchenwald in 1945. 10 of his siblings died in the Holocaust. He later wrote an autobiography titled From the Holocaust to Hogan's Heroes. These men chose to make Nazis look like the biggest idiots on television every single week for 6 seasons. That wasn't just comedy, that was something else entirely. Werner Klemperer, by the way, only agreed to play Klink on one condition, that his character never win, not once. Every episode had to end with Hogan outsmarting the Germans. Klemperer insisted on it. And the show never aired in Germany for more than 25 years after it ended. You were watching this after school as a kid and laughing at Schultz saying, "I know nothing, I know nothing." And underneath that was one of the most quietly defiant creative decisions in television history. I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched. You may have thought these were basically the same show. A woman with magical powers, a man trying to hide it from everyone, domestic chaos every week. You weren't wrong, but the story of how both shows ended up on television at the same time is more entertaining than most of the episodes. Bewitched came first. It launched on ABC in 1964. A witch named Samantha marries a regular man named Darren. She agrees not to use magic. She uses magic constantly anyway. The show was an immediate hit, second most watched program in America in its debut year. NBC saw this and said, "We want one of those." So they hired a producer named Sidney Sheldon and told him to make their version. He came up with I Dream of Jeannie, which premiered in 1965. An astronaut crash lands on a deserted island, finds a bottle, opens it, and out pops a 2,000-year-old Jeannie who immediately calls him Master. Now, the producers of Jeannie specifically did not want a blonde lead character because Bewitched already had a blonde. So they held auditions, couldn't find anyone better, and eventually cast Barbara Eden, a blonde, anyway. The bottle Jeannie lived in was not made for the show. It was a Jim Beam bourbon whiskey decanter from 1964, painted gold and decorated. Someone in the art department found it. That's Jeannie's home, a repurposed bottle of bourbon. Barbara Eden was pregnant when the show was picked up. They filmed 10 episodes as fast as possible before she got too big to hide it, adding more veils and fabric to her costume each week. She later joked that by the end, she looked like a walking tent. And here's the fact that makes the whole show feel different. Larry Hagman, the actor who played Tony Nelson, Jeannie's astronaut, would later become J.R. Ewing on Dallas. The charming space-age hero became one of the most famous TV villains of the 1980s. You watched him at 4 p.m. as the good guy, and a few years later, at 9 p.m. as the opposite. Barbara Eden herself said that marrying off Jeannie and Tony in the final season was a mistake. It ruined the show, she told an interviewer. Because Jeannie wasn't human. The tension was that she was trying to fit into a world she wasn't from. Once they got married, that tension disappeared. The show ended 1 season later. As for Bewitched, it outlasted Jeannie by 2 years, running until 1972. And if you ever noticed that Darren Stevens seemed like a different person depending on the episode, that's because he literally was. The original actor, Dick York, was quietly replaced mid-run by a different actor named Dick Sargent. The show never explained it. They just hoped you wouldn't notice. Most kids didn't. The Munsters and the Addams Family. Here's a fact that should make you feel like the universe is slightly broken. The Addams Family premiered on ABC on September 18, 1964. The Munsters premiered on CBS on September 24, 1964. 6 days apart, on competing networks. Both shows featured a family of monsters living in a big spooky house. Both ran for exactly 2 seasons. Both were canceled in 1966, within a month of each other. Both live on in reruns to this day. If you've ever confused the two, you were not alone. That argument about which was which has been happening since 1964. Here's the actual difference. The Addams Family came from a comic strip by Charles Addams that had been running in the New Yorker magazine since the late 1930s. The family was wealthy, eccentric, and morbid in a very sophisticated, dark-humored way. Gomez and Morticia were, despite everything, deeply in love. The show was sharp and slightly intellectual. The Munsters were the working-class version. Herman Munster, a Frankenstein's monster, had a regular job. He went to work. He worried about money. He was, underneath the bolts, basically a sitcom dad who happened to look terrifying. The Munsters were also heavily inspired by Universal Studios' monster movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. Which means George Barris, the same custom car designer who built the Batmobile for the Batman TV series, also built the Munster coach. One garage, the Batmobile and the Munster coach. That man had a very specific skill set. Here's the fact that lands differently once you know it. The Addams family characters didn't have names in the original cartoons. Charles Addams drew them for 25 years in The New Yorker and never named them. It wasn't until the TV show was greenlit in 1964 that the characters got names. Wednesday, Pugsley, Gomez, Morticia, Lurch, Fester, none of those existed before the show. Wednesday specifically was named after the old nursery rhyme, Wednesday's child is full of woe. Someone mentioned this to Charles Addams during production. He liked it. And Ted Cassidy, who played Lurch, the enormous, slow-moving butler, also played Thing, the disembodied hand in the box. Same actor, two characters, in the same scene whenever Lurch was somewhere else. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You?, Speed Racer, and Star Trek? Not every rerun was a live-action sitcom. Depending on your local station and your time slot, your afternoon might have included some of the most foundational cartoons in American history, or something that looked like the future. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Launched in 1969, and unlike most shows on this list, it never really stopped. Hanna-Barbera kept making new Scooby content all the way through the 1980s, rebranding it, adding characters, changing the format almost every year. Gen X didn't just watch Scooby in reruns. Gen X watched Scooby as it was happening. New episodes on Saturday mornings, old episodes in afternoon syndication, all running at the same time. 4 teenagers and a talking Great Dane solving mysteries that always ended with a guy in a mask. The formula was so rigid you could set a clock to the unmasking. You knew it was coming, you watched anyway. Speed Racer was different. It came from Japan, one of the first anime series to be dubbed into English and broadcast in the United States starting in 1967. The car was called the Mach 5. The racing sequences were genuinely exciting for a cartoon, and the dialogue, because of the dubbing, was slightly out of sync in a way that somehow made it feel more intense. Speed Racer introduced a generation to Japanese animation before most of them had any idea that's what they were watching. And then there was Star Trek. The original Star Trek ran on NBC from 1966 to 1969. 3 seasons, canceled before it found its audience. Sound familiar? It went into syndication in the early 1970s and became one of the most beloved science fiction franchises in human history. The conventions, the movies, the spin-off series, all of that traces back to local stations airing the original 79 episodes in the afternoon to kids who had no idea they were watching something that would matter for 50 years. The Beverly Hillbillies. Simple concept. A poor mountain family from the Ozarks strikes oil, becomes rich overnight, and moves to Beverly Hills. Granny Clampett cannot understand why anything works the way it does. Ellie Mae keeps bringing home animals. Jethro Bodine is the human equivalent of a screen door on a submarine. It was one of the most watched shows in television history during its original run in the early 1960s. By the time you caught it in reruns, it still held up because the joke never stopped being funny. Mr. Ed was a talking horse. That's it. An architect named Wilbur gets a horse named Mr. Ed who can speak, but only to Wilbur, which means Wilbur is constantly looking insane to everyone around him. The show ran from 1961 to 1966. The horse, a trained palomino, was able to move his lips because the trainers conditioned him to move his tongue when he heard a specific cue. For years, the rumor was that they put peanut butter in his mouth to make him talk. That's not true, but it's more fun to believe. Lost in Space, 1965 to 1968. A family gets lost in space after their ship is sabotaged. The robot, with his extendable arms and warning cry of "Danger, Will Robinson," became one of the most recognizable characters in 1960s television. The villain, Dr. Smith, was supposed to be menacing and was instead a campy, cowardly scene stealer who became the real reason people kept watching. And like nearly everything else on this list, Gen X caught it almost entirely in reruns. Next is MASH. Most of the shows on this list were shows you found in reruns after they were already over. MASH was different. MASH started in 1972. Some of you, the older end of Gen X, remember watching new episodes, and then the reruns, and then more reruns, for years. The show was set during the Korean War, which ran from 1950 to 1953. MASH the TV show ran from 1972 to 1983. 11 years, about a 3-year war. The show lasted almost 4 times longer than the actual conflict it depicted. As the years went on, it stopped being a straightforward comedy. It started dealing with harder things, trauma, what war does to people, how you hold on to your humanity when everything around you is designed to destroy it. And it still had jokes. Somehow it kept both things going at once. On February 28, 1983, the final episode aired. Nearly 106 million people watched it. The United States population in 1983 was 233 million. Almost half the country was watching the same television program at the same moment. At the peak, the final 6 minutes, 121 million people were tuned in. That number has never been touched by a scripted TV show. Not Cheers, not Seinfeld, not Friends. Nothing. It's still the record, more than 40 years later. The New York City water system saw a pressure surge right after the finale ended, because millions of people had been sitting still for 2.5 hours, and the moment it was over, they all got up to use the bathroom at the same time. That is what a television show used to be able to do. Here's what's actually interesting about all of this. None of these shows were made for you. Gilligan's Island was for 1964. The Brady Bunch was for 1969. Hogan's Heroes, Bewitched, The Munsters, all of it was for boomers, first run, prime time, a different decade. And yet, you got them. You got them in the wrong order, on the wrong channel, after school, on a Tuesday, in a time slot no one was fighting over. And you loved them more than the people they were originally made for. There's a reason that argument, Ginger or Mary Ann, Addams Family or Munsters, Jeannie or Bewitched, was so intense on every playground from 1975 to 1990. It's because those shows gave you something to think about together, something shared. There were only so many channels, you watched the same things, so you had the same conversations. That's gone now. Not better, not worse, just gone. 106 million people watching the same ending at the same time, not because they planned to, but because that's just what was on. That world is over. You got to be part of it. Which of these reruns was your favorite? Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, kindly hit the like and subscribe button below. And you can check out one of these videos next. See you there.